Welcome everyone. I am Luca, a PhD student at the Center of Law and Economics here at ETH Zurich. And I'm super excited today because we get the chance to talk to Professor Daniel Hemel. Daniel is a professor of law at New York University. His wide-ranging research explores topics in taxation, intellectual property, administrative and constitutional law. And today we will discuss his recent working paper, The Law and the New Dynamic Public Finance. Welcome, Professor Hemel.
Thanks very much for having me here, Luca.
Now, before we delve deep into the discussion of the paper, why don't you give us a brief summary of the background of the paper and of the paper itself?
Thanks, Luca. To understand law and the new dynamic public finance, it might be helpful to start with the old static public finance, classic optimal tax theory. Classic optimal tax theory originates with a 1971 paper by the British economist and future Nobel laureate James Mirrlees. Mirrlees presents us with the following thought experiment. The government is trying to choose a welfare maximizing tax schedule following one round of a natural lottery. And in the natural lottery, we all get a value that economists refer to as theta, the Greek letter theta. Theta reflects our skill or our productivity, our ability to convert time into money. The government can observe our income, but it can't observe our underlying theta value. And the government needs to establish a tax schedule that redistributes as much as possible from high theta individuals to low theta individuals, while still giving high theta individuals an incentive to reveal their type. Mirrlees writes this paper in 1971. There are several follow-on papers, including an important paper by Tony Atkinson and Joseph Stiglitz from 1976 that extends this model from one period to two periods. But in the Atkinson-Stiglitz model, individuals only work in the first period and they retire in the second period. And the combination of the 1971 paper by Mirrlees and the 1976 paper by Atkinson and Stiglitz have had a huge impact not only on economics, but on legal scholarship. But since the late 1970s, economists have made huge progress in building upon this classic optimal tax theory and adding two important elements. One is changing productivities. So instead of just one round of the natural lottery, there are multiple rounds of the natural lottery. We don't just get one theta value in our life. We might start off as high theta, but then experience some disability shock that renders us low theta in the future. So in addition to changing productivities, there are also changing policies. The government can change tax policy over time, and what it says will be tax policy in the future might not actually be tax policy in the future. So the combination of changing productivities and changing policies has been hugely generative for optimal tax theory. That's the new dynamic public finance. New dynamic public finance papers have been published in all the top economics journals. New dynamic public finance insights are reflected in the introductory public finance textbooks in the United States and other countries. But the new dynamic public finance has had only a limited influence on legal scholarship. And what Law in the New Dynamic Public Finance, my paper, tries to do is to translate the highly technical insights from this economics literature into language that lawyers and laypeople can understand and to derive concrete policy implications.
Cool, very interesting. The idea of a changing theta, of course, resonates a lot with me as a PhD student. I'm counting a lot on the fact that my ability to change money, to change time into money will increase in the future.
Your observation about being a PhD student is actually hugely important to one of the main insights of the new dynamic public finance. Early on in our working lives, when we're in our 20s and early 30s, the distribution of income is relatively egalitarian. My guess is you are one of the very best students in your high school class, and your income is not that much higher, in fact, likely lower than some students in your high school class who are lower theta than you. But if we fast forward 20 or 30 years, we'll see a much greater dispersion of income from the graduates of your high school. So we know that theta shocks accumulate over the life cycle, and the income distribution becomes less egalitarian over the life cycle. And this leads to important policy implications. The more unequal society is, the more redistribution we will want. The more exposed we are to theta shocks, the more we will want the government to insure us against productivity risk. And this suggests that the tax schedule should become more progressive over the life cycle because there's less redistribution to accomplish in our 20s than there is in our 50s. We can think of societies as moving from everyone is more or less Sweden, a very egalitarian society when people are in their 20s, and we become more like the United States or Brazil as we move into our 50s. There are age-dependent features of many tax systems, but no tax system has fully leveraged the power of age-dependent taxation to improve welfare.
You propose that under certain circumstances, capital taxation actually enhances efficiency while advancing equity. A claim that goes against the traditional assumption of an inevitable efficiency-equity trade-off. Could you, for us, break down how that works and what those specific circumstances are?
One of the insights of the new dynamic public finance is that the government might deviate from its promised policy. It might say there will be low capital taxes in the future, but then it might raise capital taxes in the future. And in fact, if the government could have a one-time capital tax and promise not to do it again, it would want to do that because it would be accomplishing its goal of redistribution without any efficiency loss, since a one-time capital tax can't distort decisions that were made in the past. The prospect of a one-time capital tax, however, insofar as it hovers over people, has a hugely efficiency-reducing effect. So a challenge for the government is how to credibly commit to keeping capital taxes low. The incentive to have a large capital tax, a capital levy, arises because of wealth inequality. If there were no wealth inequality, there'd be no redistribution to accomplish. So put another way, wealth inequality undermines the credibility of capital tax policy because it creates an incentive for capital levies. So with that background, a capital tax can potentially be efficiency enhancing if the relatively moderate capital tax reduces wealth inequality. Because by reducing wealth inequality, it renders more credible the government's promise not to expropriate in the future. And this might seem like a highly abstract idea, but we have historical examples of countries using capital taxation in order to bolster the credibility of capital tax commitments. In the 1930s, in the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt argued that we needed to have a higher capital tax in the United States then, or else the Bolsheviks were going to come to the United States. We can think of FDR as having anticipated the insights of the new dynamic public finance. So under conditions of rising wealth inequality, like in the 1920s and 1930s in the United States, and possibly in the 2010s and 2020s, a moderate capital tax, rather than reflecting a trade-off between equity and efficiency, can potentially advance both equity and efficiency.
Fascinating. And to be honest, a little bit complicated, which brings me to my next question. You introduce some complex ideas, such as age-based tax schedules. Do you think that such dynamic, complex tax systems could risk increasing administrative costs and compliance challenges?
Certainly, as the tax system becomes more complex, administrative costs and compliance challenges will arise. The new dynamic public finance, though, doesn't just generate new policy prescriptions, it generates new justifications for existing policies. So in the United States and in many other industrialized democracies, we actually have very complicated tax schedules that depend upon past income. In the United States, the disability insurance benefits that I would get if I became disabled today would depend upon my income in the previous period. And the new dynamic public finance helps to explain why we might want history-dependent tax schedules that we already have if we think of the disability insurance system and the Social Security system as part of a broader tax and transfer system. Also, some of the most promising proposals arising from the new dynamic public finance are relatively simple to implement. For example, age-dependent tax schedules. The government already knows my age. It's much easier to figure out my age than my income level. So having a tax schedule that depends upon age would not be that difficult. And in many countries, including the United States, we already have some age-dependent tax provisions. In the United States, you can begin to withdraw tax-free from retirement accounts once you reach age 59 and a half. The standard deduction in the United States rises once we reach age 65 in the United States. The new dynamic public finance helps us understand how to optimize age-dependent features of the tax schedule, but we already have age-dependent features of the tax schedule.
Cool. Thank you for sharing your research with us today. To conclude, why don't you sum up again what policymakers can learn from this and what are areas that require future research?
In terms of what policymakers can learn from this, I think the possibility of age-dependent taxation or leveraging the possibility of age-dependent taxation is one of the easiest takeaways because it's based on a readily verifiable characteristic of individuals, and there are relatively clear policy prescriptions that arise from the new dynamic public finance. We want progressivity to increase from early adulthood into midlife, and we want to redistribute from people in midlife to people in early adulthood who tend to have lower incomes. Another clear prescription is that we want to use capital taxes in order to bolster the credibility of capital tax policy, in order to keep wealth inequality under control so that the fear of expropriation remains tamped down. In terms of pathways for future research, one important question is how to best use history-dependent taxes in order to redistribute. So I mentioned before that we already have history-dependent taxes baked in to our disability insurance and Social Security systems, but how exactly to calibrate that is a generative pathway for future work. Another is understanding the sources of credible commitment in capital tax policy will require further work and interdisciplinary work, leveraging insights not just from economics, but from political science, history, sociology, in order to understand how governments are able to engender credibility.
Thank you again, Professor Hemel, for being with us today. We are very much looking forward to your future research in this area.
Thanks for hosting me.
And to all the vlog listeners and viewers, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did, and hopefully see you again next time.